Hi everyone, and welcome back to History of Medicine. If you can believe it, we've made it to the last week of the semester. Hurrah! During the last few months, we've embarked on a whirlwind tour of the world's major medical traditions, and this week, we're bringing things home, focusing on Central Asia and the evolution of its own medical systems. Our focus is going to be on the contemporary period, and the goal of this week's discussions is to pick up where we left off last week. That is, to continue our examination of invented traditions and see how applicable they are in the context of Central Asian medicine. Before getting to that, however, I'd like to set the scene by providing you all with some background information on this topic. What kinds of medicine have historically been practiced in Central Asia, and how have the systems of thought and practice characteristic of the region evolved over the centuries? Focusing specifically on Kazakhstan, in what follows, I'm going to briefly highlight some of the key moments in the story of Central Asian medicine. As will be seen, for a very long time, Kazakhstan has been home to lots of different medical customs and practices. In addition to boasting a very diverse, pluralistic set of medical systems, Kazakhstan has also been a place where most people generally have made no distinction between what Europeans would call science and superstition. Historically, there has not been a strict divide between the spiritual and the secular, and this has helped give medicine in Kazakhstan a very eclectic, blended, hybridized nature. So, to begin at the beginning, or roughly. As many of you doubtless know, the Kazakh people originated as a group of pastoral nomads whose homeland encompassed the area south of Siberia, west of China, and east of the Caspian Sea. For much of their history, Kazakhs were sheep herders and equestrians, and they organized themselves into 3 hordes, or Jews, which you can see here on the screen. Until the 10th century, the Kazakhs were relatively isolated from the world's major civilizations, but around that time, Arab conquests led to the introduction of Islam. While many converted to this new faith and adopted various elements of Arabic culture, on the whole, Islam's influence was less notable here than in the Muslim lands of the Middle East. The practice of veiling, for example, never permeated the region to any great extent, and many pre-Islamic beliefs and rituals persisted. So too did pastoralism and nomadism. Several centuries later, during the reign of Peter II, Russia began colonizing Central Asia, and in the next couple hundred years, millions of Slavs migrated here. By 1916, Europeans were the most numerous demographic group in northern Kazakhstan. Russian colonization forced more and more Kazakhs to take up a sedentary life as farmers, but even with Kazakhstan's incorporation into the USSR after 1917, the majority of the country's inhabitants lived in rural areas. The great mixing of cultures and peoples that we've just talked about was responsible for producing an eclectic blend of ideas about the body, health, and disease. It also produced a complex, multifaceted mix of medical theories and practices. The earliest of these was pre-Islamic and was highly spiritual in nature. Like many other pastoral groups, pre-modern Kazakhs worshipped nature, the sun, the sky, the stars, and the moon. They believed that their ancestors held sway over every aspect of life, and illness was thought to result from the work of evil spirits. In order to cure illness, many turned to shamans known as Baksi. The Baksi were part fortune teller, part sorcerer, and part healer. They were said to have the power to change the weather, to interpret dreams, and to cure sickness by exorcising evil spirits. In order to determine the specific spirit responsible for causing a particular malady, they first performed a séance, during which a 2-stringed instrument called a kobiz was used to communicate with the spirit world, and specifically to draw evil spirits into battle with the good ones that the Baksi had summoned. Once the spirits answered the Baksi's summons, his or her body would become a battleground between good and evil spirits. This battle could last hours, days, or even weeks. Incantations and music were used, along with more interventionist means of exorcism, for example, spitting on a patient's eyes or beating them with whips or sticks. Animal sacrifice was also sometimes used. As Islam made inroads into Central Asia from the 10th century forward, a number of new medical customs were imported into the region. Religious leaders known as mullahs played a prominent role as healers, offering prayers for the sick, preparing amulets to ward off the evil eye, dousing their patients with Meccan holy water, and reading excerpts from the Quran for ritual healing. Like shamans, mullahs were believed to possess a special connection to the spirit world, and to some extent, the practices of shamans and mullahs were indistinguishable. They often bled into one another. So too was their overlap with folk healers. Known as tamarshi, these healers used lots of plant and animal products to cure illnesses. Tamarshi often diagnosed illness by taking a patient's pulse, and at times they resorted to bloodletting. The most common illnesses treated by them included fevers, diarrhea, headaches, venereal diseases, and rabies. One especially famous tamarshi was Altai Hoja, who allegedly cured tuberculosis with a months-long regimen of fermented mare's milk, lamb, butter, and roots. Russian colonizers looked askance at all of these practices. Whether writing of shamans, mullahs, or folk healers, they had nothing but criticism for Kazakh medicine, which they saw as backward and barbaric. Methods of folk healing were said to be both ineffective and dangerous, and shamans were said to be quacks, that is, healers who dupe their patients with tricks. Criticisms like this served as one of the key justifications for Russian colonization. Because its native healers were so bad, the argument went, the Kazakh people were weak and unhealthy. They thus badly needed Russian medical assistance, which would be extended to Kazakhstan once it became formally incorporated into the Russian Empire. Medicine, in fact, was one of the key tools of empire for the Russians. Arguments about widespread Kazakh illness and about the total inefficacy of Kazakh physicians made it seem like Russian colonization was benevolent, something being done not to exploit the Kazakh people and their resources, but to extend the blessings of civilization to them. With Russian colonization, Western biomedicine started to make inroads into Kazakhstan. By the end of the 1870s, there were about 279 Russian doctors in the region, and by 1913, there were 89 Russian-style hospitals throughout the country. The late 19th century gave us the first Russian-educated Kazakh doctor, Muhammadjan Korabayev, who earned an MD from Kazan University in 1888. However, for the most part, biomedical specialists remained inaccessible to the bulk of the Kazakh population, which lived outside the cities and large towns these medical services were concentrated in. The coming of the Soviet Union changed things somewhat. The effort to equip Kazakhstan with Soviet-trained medical professionals began in 1928, when Stalin's first five-year plan brought funds for the construction of 5 new medical colleges in the country. At the center of this biomedical education campaign was the Kazakh Medical Institute. Established in 1931, it provided graduate training in medicine, and its graduates included physical therapists, surgeons, obstetricians, and gynecologists. With the passage of time, the number of medical schools grew, so that by 1948, there were 18 different medical vocational schools in Kazakhstan, with a total population of just over 4,000 students who learned how to be nurses, pharmacists, physician's assistants, midwives, and various kinds of specialist doctors. These were impressive achievements, without a doubt, and yet biomedicine failed to completely replace the country's pre-existing medical systems. There were lots of reasons for this. Some were educational. While educational leaders tried to enroll lots of indigenous Kazakhs in Soviet medical schools, restrictive admissions criteria, like, for example, requiring students to be fluent in Russian, meant that relatively few Central Asians obtained MDs. Secondly, while Soviet officials publicly professed a desire to create an indigenous biomedical cadre, in private, they were often suspicious of Kazakh students' political and cultural loyalties. Within Kazakhstan, the majority of the victims of Stalin's Great Terror of the late 1930s were non-Russians, and many of them were doctors. By the end of 1938, for example, the Great Terror had claimed 28 of the 133 faculty members at the Kazakh Medical Institute. 35% of those purged were Kazakhs, while only 17% were Russian. Further purges followed in the 1950s, when dozens of Kazakh medical students and professors were dismissed from universities on charges of nationalism and Islamicism. Aside from problems in medical education, Soviet biomedicine was also fairly ineffective in terms of the medical care provided to the population. In terms of quantity, again, it appears the Soviets made great strides. In 1928, at the start of Stalin's first 5-year plan, there were only 89 hospitals in the country. By 1944, there were 675, with a total capacity of 28,000 beds. By 1947, the country's varied Soviet medical institutions employed some 47,000 doctors, nurses, and support staff. Unfortunately, the places they worked were often quite lacking. Medicines, equipment, and even basic amenities like heating were often in short supply at hospitals and clinics, and some of these facilities also went without bathtubs, soap, adequate food, and proper sanitation. Dirt, cold, lice, and soiled sheets were common in many Soviet hospitals. The people who worked here were affected by these problems and sometimes had quite low morale, coming in drunk to work and abusing drugs and other illicit substances. If medical personnel complained about the adverse conditions they labored under, they could be denounced by authorities and sent to the Gulag. One of the most innovative aspects of the Soviet campaign to introduce biomedicine into Kazakhstan was the so-called Red Yurts program. The idea behind this was to bring biomedical services to the country's rural-dwelling pastoral nomads. Trained doctors, nurses, and midwives were sent into nomadic villages where they spread information about modern hygienic practices while also caring for the medical needs of the local population. By 1929, there were 134 red yurts in operation all around the country. The yurts were mobile medical facilities, and they typically remained in a given village or encampment for about 5 to 10 days. Among other things, red yurts offered vaccination against smallpox, treatment for sexually transmitted diseases, and instruction on sanitary food preparation. They also conducted gynecological exams. The Red Yurts campaign did bring some improvements in health, but unfortunately all of these were undermined by the Soviet collectivization campaign, during which authorities tried to forcibly sedentarize the country's pastoral peoples. This was an absolute disaster. While bringing an end to nomadism, the campaign also produced widespread famine, and with mass malnutrition and starvation came a variety of lethal diseases that Soviet authorities did little about. In 1932 alone, some 1.5 million Kazakhs perished from famine or related illnesses as a result of the Soviet collectivization drive. Many resisted this, and the ill will toward Soviet authorities bred by this campaign made many Kazakhs suspicious of biomedicine. This, too, allowed for the continued survival of earlier medical traditions. Okay, that's all the time we've got for now. I hope that you found this lecture informative. With a basic understanding of the history of Kazakh medicine, we can now proceed to discuss the contemporary era, which is what we're going to do for the rest of the week. We've got a couple of articles to read on this. Please see the email I sent out for questions on these, and when you've thought of some preliminary answers to them, please head over to the discussion forum to share your ideas. I look forward to reading and commenting on your responses, and we'll see you all real soon. Bye-bye for now.